First, let me say that I am not a vegetarian. I used to be. When I was in college, I read The Sexual Politics of Meat by Carol Adams and was converted right on the spot. The groundwork was already there. I was living on my own and cooking on my own for the first time, and it wasn't going well. The first time I tried to cut up a chicken, I just wept through the whole experience. So Adams didn't have to work hard to convince me. Still, it was bumpy at first. I pretty much lived on quesadillas and spaghetti. I was a strict vegetarian for about 6 years. I wasn't a proselytizer. It did come up. In fact, as I remember it, sometimes often people were hostile when I declined meat, no matter how polite. It seems much easier today to be a vegetarian than it did then. At the time, I usually tried to explain that I had come to the conclusion that for me personally, living mindfully meant that if I wasn't willing to kill it, chop it up, and cook it myself, I probably shouldn't eat it. I was just really squeamish. And I was trying my best to live an examined life. And if they weren't squeamish, then perhaps eating meat wasn't something that they needed to examine. I applied my best diplomacy, framing it as a personal, ethical choice that each person could make for themselves. And while I personally harbored some strong opinions about the meat industry, I was aware that changing that industry wasn't going to be accomplished by converting the country to vegetarianism. Systemic change just doesn't work that way. Then I was accepted as a Peace Corps volunteer and told that I would be serving in what at the time was the fourth most poverty-stricken country in the world, Mali in West Africa. I quickly realized that maintaining a vegetarian diet wouldn't be possible while I was there. Food was going to be scarce and the options were going to be limited. I would need to be flexible. I would need to be grateful and gracious. Once I started adding meat back into my diet, I was really dismayed to realize that actually I had a lot of ego tied up in being a vegetarian. It turns out that despite talking a good game about not judging people for making their own decisions about eating meat, I had this whole virtuous purity thing going on that I had to come to grips with. Because looking around me at my neighbors in Mali, it was clear that what I had thought was virtue was definitely privilege. Over the years, I have sometimes fallen completely off the wagon, vegetarian speaking, and sometimes I've been mostly vegetarian. But I never again have been a strict vegetarian. I just insist on the occasional bacon cheeseburger just to keep myself humble. This time of year, many people make resolutions about paying attention to what they eat. This is typically about eating healthier, about losing weight. I have a few friends who have an annual dry January. Eating healthy is a laudable goal. But for our purposes here today, I would like to talk about how food, the intentionality that we bring to food, can be good for the soul too. How do we go about investing our meal times with spiritual meaning? One of the most time-honored practices is to put restrictions around what you're willing to eat, like vegetarianism. Everyone already has a line that they draw. This is what I will eat. This is what I won't. Some people won't eat anything with a face. Some people, vegans, won't eat anything that comes from animals, such as dairy or honey. Some people will eat cows, but not baby cows. Others won't eat red meat, but enjoy chicken and fish. Maybe they only eat organic, or only humanely raised, or only local. I'm willing to bet that most of the people here today would put dogs or rats or insects on their no list. While I was living in Mali, Mark, then my boyfriend, was living in Europe. When my vacation time came up, I joined him to visit his family in Switzerland. We went on a breathtaking hike that wended its way to a charming restaurant on top of a mountain. The chef's specialty was steak, specifically horse steak. At that moment in time, while I had been living in West Africa, it was not the most alarming thing that I had been offered to eat. I thought, why not? Honestly, it was tasty. It did not taste like chicken. The best part was that when I went back to Sofara, which was the town where I lived in Mali, and I mentioned it in passing to my friends there, 201, every single one of them, they were like, ah, gross. I confess that once I discovered this, I gleefully told the story of what I had eaten in that restaurant in Switzerland to anyone who would listen, just to watch them shudder. So everyone draws a line somewhere. The Jewish tradition of keeping kosher, or similarly halal in the Muslim faith, are a way of bringing intentionality to meal times. The Rabbi Harold Kushner describes it this way: there's nothing intrinsically wicked about eating pork or lobster, and there's nothing intrinsically moral about eating cheese or chicken instead. But what the Jewish way of life does by imposing rules on our eating, sleeping, and working habits is to take the most common and mundane activities and invest them with deeper meaning, turning every one of them into an occasion for obeying or disobeying God. If a Gentile walks into a fast food establishment and orders a cheeseburger, he's just having lunch. But if a Jew does the same thing, he's making a theological statement. The fact is that the rules of keeping kosher have nothing to do with trichinosis or contamination. They have everything to do with taking the process of eating, which we share with all other animals, and making it a uniquely human activity by investing it with considerations of permitted and forbidden. Kushner goes on to explain that humane slaughtering practices and prohibiting serving the meat of an animal alongside its own mother's milk is less about the animal, who, after all, is dead, and more about being vigilant and preventing apathy and tolerance of cruelty in the human who is doing the eating. Dietary laws turn eating into a religious activity. I'm sure that many vegetarians and vegans, regardless of their faith tradition, would find that this idea resonates with their own experience. But that's not the only way to bring intentionality to your meals. I think a lot of us, when we think about meaningful meals, we probably think first of holidays: Thanksgiving, Christmas or Passover, the 4th of July cookout. There are cherished dishes. There's a coming together of family, be it chosen or given, certain rituals associated with each specific feast. Their ritualized nature and their focus on community or family gives them gravitas. There are other, more frequent meals that have a similar echo of ritual and community. A regular Sunday dinner with the extended family, for instance, or Friday nights with a group of friends at a favorite restaurant, or trading houses for a potluck. Or maybe it's as private and simple as having Thursday nights be the night that you try new recipes, making curiosity and a zest for new tastes into a kind of practice, like Elliot talked about earlier. Those of you who have gardens know the satisfaction of eating something that you nurtured with your own 2 hands. I myself am not a gardener, but I can definitely appreciate the desire to take the anonymity out of our food choices. Having a plot at the community garden, making the weekly pilgrimage to the farmer's market, or subscribing to a community supported agriculture, a CSA, where you receive a box of locally grown produce each week. All of these are ways of feeling more connected to the circle of life and more connected to your community. I don't necessarily need to know that the chicken I just ordered was named Colin, but knowing where your food is coming from and feeling that you're a part of that community can be very meaningful. And then there is the practice of saying grace. I'm sure that many of you, like me, grew up in homes that said grace before the meal. My family holds hands. As a child, I especially loved to sit by my grandfather at the head of the table and hold his hand during the blessing. He would tap his thumb back and forth on my thumb, and it always felt like it was our little secret. It was my favorite part of the meal. Grace brings intention to the meal by focusing everyone on the moment there together. It's like the prelude at the beginning of the service, bringing everyone into a mindful anticipation. If the idea of prayer is one that you aren't comfortable with, you might still consider taking a moment to call attention to the abundance of Mother Nature, the sacrifice of the animals, to the human labor in the fields, the farms, the stores, or in your own home that made the meal possible. And also to the company that you're sharing the meal with, which is usually the best part of the meal, of any meal. Perhaps the simplest way to imbue mealtimes with spirit might just be being mindful and present to the meal itself. So often we eat our meals absentmindedly while we watch TV or scroll through our phones. I never had the pleasure of meeting Mark's grandmother, Nina, but she lives on in stories and quotes in our household. One that comes up often is how when she would catch Mark sneaking a book at the supper table or shoveling his food quickly in order to run back outside to play, she would snap, Mark, mit Verstand, with understanding. She wanted him to be present to the food, to really taste it, to honor it, to honor both the food and the cook by paying attention. Many of us aspire to make meditation a part of our lives, but despair of finding the time. What if being fully present to your meal was your meditation? Any good spiritual practice requires attention, intention, and repetition. There's an opportunity for that 3 times per day at the dining table. Amen.